The global balance in 1940 was more fragile than it appeared. Minimal decisions, specific delays, or unexpected absences were enough for the course of the war to begin tilting in a different direction. British leadership fractured, resistance was isolated, and German military supremacy became a tangible possibility. From there, ideological, territorial, and cultural restructuring would advance unchecked. Traditional institutions would be replaced, freedoms would be nullified, and power would be concentrated in a system designed to endure. Opposition would not be limited, it would be eliminated. History would not follow its course, but would be frozen under a single doctrine. How would the world really be if the Nazis had won? How far would their extermination plan have reached? How long could a society resist before breaking the silence and beginning to fight? The British surrender, the moment when everything collapsed. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched triumphantly through the Champs-Élysées. France had collapsed in barely 6 weeks under the blitzkrieg tactic, leaving the United Kingdom without its main European ally and creating a colossal strategic vacuum on the Western Front. In London, Winston Churchill faced immense pressures. Lord Halifax advocated for Italian mediation to achieve peace with Hitler. In our reality, Churchill resisted these pressures, but in this alternative universe, events would take a dramatically different turn. Hitler made a decision that would change the course of the war. He advanced his air offensive to June 18, 1940, 3 weeks earlier than historically. This decision offered two crucial advantages. It surprised a United Kingdom that was barely reorganizing its defenses and allowed neutralizing the RAF before its complete reorganization. Unlike the historical course, the Luftwaffe avoided bombing civilian cities, concentrating exclusively on strategic military objectives. The impact was devastating. In 2 weeks, more than 30 coastal radar stations were rendered useless. The RAF lost more than 300 fighters in unequal combat. The British air shield began to disintegrate before consolidating. On June 24th occurred the tragedy that would seal British destiny. Churchill was flying secretly towards Halifax to meet with Roosevelt when his Bristol-Bombay aircraft suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure over Greenland. There were no survivors. Churchill disappeared forever, taking with him the fiercest voice of resistance. The loss created a critical leadership vacuum. Lord Halifax was named interim Prime Minister, precisely the one who had advocated for negotiated peace. Within weeks, the United Kingdom found itself on the brink of an unthinkable capitulation under Churchill. Meanwhile, the War Cabinet fractured. The voices that previously backed resistance began to align with pragmatism arguments. There was already talk of avoiding more useless blood and that history would judge with understanding. The narrative of sacrifice was replaced by that of rational compromise. The British press was silenced through an emergency decree. The BBC, symbol of national morale, began transmitting only messages approved by the Interior Security Council. In schools, teachers were asked to depoliticize content. News about the German advance was minimized or simply omitted. Without a figure like Churchill to galvanize the population, panic grew. Trains were saturated with civilians fleeing northward. Southern cities slowly emptied. Thousands of children were sent to the countryside without security guarantees. Evacuation images became routine. Fear was not a sensation, it was the new national language. Meanwhile, Operation Sea Lion, historically cancelled, now became viable thanks to German air supremacy and the collapse of British leadership. The beaches of southern England became battlefields. By August, panzers were advancing inland. The invasion was executed with surgical precision. German units landed in Dover, Folkestone and Brighton under cover of naval artillery and selective bombings. The Home Guard offered desperate but symbolic resistance. The volunteers, armed with hunting shotguns and without real training, were quickly overcome. German transmissions showed columns of soldiers advancing through English towns while the population took refuge in basements or churches. In cities like Southampton and Canterbury, the collapse of civil infrastructure prevented any organized response. Electricity and water supplies were cut. The British chain of command was broken. From Whitehall, orders arrived late or didn't arrive at all. In Portsmouth, an entire company surrendered after receiving false information about a ceasefire. The country began to divide. In Scotland, local leaders proposed forming a parallel government. In Northern Ireland, sectarian clashes erupted that the new regime exploited to justify a German deployment in Belfast. The perception of national unity dissolved. In September 1940, Halifax announced the partial British capitulation through the Treaty of Berne. The agreement allowed the United Kingdom to preserve limited internal autonomy in exchange for withdrawing from the conflict, lifting the naval blockade and completely demilitarizing Channel ports. Although technically independent, Great Britain was reduced to a vassal state with German committees supervising press and foreign policy. The treaty was signed without parliamentary consultation or referendum. The news was broadcast by radio as a diplomatic adjustment to preserve national stability. Protests were prohibited, unions were dismantled, churches filled with faithful who prayed in silence, not yet understanding the scope of what had just occurred. Within weeks, the first liaison advisors from the Reich arrived. They did not wear military uniforms, but diplomatic suits. They installed themselves in embassies and ministries. One supervised education, another controlled economic flows, a third supervised broadcasting. The occupation was not evident. It was bureaucratic, legal, progressive. Images of Churchill began to disappear from public buildings. Libraries received new directives: remove books considered warmongering or provocative. Recent history began to be rewritten. There was no longer talk of the Blitz. There was talk of the tragedy provoked by a radical minority. This victory transformed the global strategic balance. Hitler could reorient all his war machinery towards the east. For the first time since 1914, Germany was free of enemies in the west. The United States, without Pearl Harbor or European allies, lacked justification for mobilization. The year 1940 had become the absolute turning point, paving the way towards a continental empire that seemed unbreakable. But the real blow was psychological. The fall of Great Britain not only meant a military victory, it meant the death of the myth that democracy could resist dictatorships if it fought enough. In Rome, in Tokyo, in Madrid, newspapers spoke of a new century of order. In Berlin, the Hitler Youth paraded through the Brandenburg Gate with lit torches. Radios transmitted the reading of the treaty with solemn music. Joseph Goebbels delivered a speech announcing the birth of a new Europe, clean, rational, harmonious. In cinemas, propaganda documentaries showed German soldiers greeted with flowers by carefully selected British civilians, and in London, the streets remained silent. There were no celebrations, only resignation, only questions. The British people were not conquered with bombs, but with the vacuum of leadership, administered fear, and the promise of a peace that tasted like defeat. The Order of the Reich, how Europe was rewritten from Berlin. With Great Britain neutralized, the Reich accelerated continental reorganization under an innovative model: collaborationist governments that maintained a facade of sovereignty while real control resided in Berlin. In France, Vichy completely subordinated itself to German directives. Belgium, Netherlands, and Norway were reintegrated under related regimes: De Grelle in Brussels, Mussert in The Hague, Quisling in Oslo. These regimes shared an identical political architecture: domesticated police apparatuses, decorative parliaments, and a Germanic advisory council with authority over security, commerce, and education. Incipient resistance was suffocated through a network of preventive repression and perfectly coordinated local collaborators. In Paris, the Arc de Triomphe was surrounded by Reich flags and stationed tanks as a symbolic warning. The Paris-Berlin railway line was expanded and prioritized for military and diplomatic use. French cultural broadcasts had to be approved by the Germanic Propaganda Ministry, and all cinematographic production was subordinated to the European Cultural Supervision Center, directed by German advisors. In Brussels, the Royal Palace was transformed into temporary residence for high-ranking SS commanders, while in Oslo, a Germanic Leadership Academy was established, where young Norwegians were trained in racial doctrine and obedience to the new order. Educational systems were aligned. In classrooms, school maps already showed a Europe without borders, colored with the imperial gray of the Reich. While Europe was reorganizing, Hitler executed his diplomatic masterstroke. During 1940 to 1941, German emissaries maintained secret conversations with Tokyo to redefine the Tripartite Pact. The objective: avoid a suicidal war with the United States through coordination of Soviet dismemberment from two fronts. Hitler promised Japan access to Siberia, rich in minerals and oil, in exchange for suspending offensive plans against American installations. The secret pact was sealed in Königsberg in March 1941, stipulating that Japan would attack eastern Siberia simultaneously with the German Western Offensive, with a clause expressly prohibiting attacks on American territory without joint agreement. The negotiation was supervised by Joachim von Ribbentrop and Japanese Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima. Both drafted an additional unpublished protocol where they committed to a subsequent partition of Central Asia, with Germany establishing industrial enclaves in Kazakhstan and Japan, expanding its zone of influence to the eastern Urals. In exchange, the Reich formally recognized Japanese sovereignty over Korea, Taiwan, and southern Indochina. As a measure of mutual trust, technical observer units were exchanged. A contingent of Japanese officers was assigned to study the German railway system, while Reich ballistics experts installed themselves in military academies in Manchuria. A shared intelligence network called Project Amber was founded, tasked with gathering data on Soviet positions and coordinating sabotage in key cities like Irkutsk and Novosibirsk. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Barbarossa with increased forces. More than 4 million soldiers freed from the Western Front. Simultaneously, the Kwantung Army crossed the Amur, attacking Vladivostok and Khabarovsk. Stalin, surprised by the coordinated attack, tried to organize defense from Moscow, but his position became untenable. The Soviet logistical chain collapsed under dual pressure. Ural supply lines were cut by Japanese, while the Wehrmacht advanced without cohesive resistance. By the end of 1941, Minsk, Kiev, and Sebastopol had fallen. Moscow resisted until January 1942, when it fell after brutal siege. Stalin was evacuated to Novosibirsk, but his communications became intermittent. The Japanese offensive in the Far East was equally demolishing. In barely 3 weeks, they captured Vladivostok, blocked maritime traffic in the Sea of Okhotsk, and isolated Soviet Pacific units. In Yakutia, detention camps were formed for prisoners of war captured in the taiga, and local populations were subjected to imperial re-education. Germany used military success as a political tool. In Minsk, a provisional civil administration was installed under German control, which proclaimed the restoration of European order. In Kiev, a new currency was introduced, the Reich hryvnia, backed by the Eastern Investment Bank. Captured Soviet industries were distributed among Reich corporations like IG Farben and Krupp, while workers were forced to labor under slavery conditions. By mid-1942, the USSR was a fragmented mosaic of occupied zones and scattered guerrillas. The Soviet regime lost its fundamental cohesion. Germany and Japan divided the territory into two spheres, the Western zone under Germanic influence and the Eastern zone under Asian development. In the Volga region, a security cordon was created where racial filtration camps were installed. Inhabitants were genetically evaluated, divided according to productive utility or ideological risk. In the Urals, the Japanese built an armored railway line known as the Imperial Thread, which connected captured mining installations with the port of Magadan. Meanwhile, Stalin was progressively isolated. His circle of trust was reduced to loyalists without real operational capacity. The Politburo dissolved de facto, and Soviet radios stopped transmitting from December 1942. The red flag continued flying in some strongholds, but no longer represented a cohesive force. In occupied territory, spontaneous resistance outbreaks emerged. In Belarusian forests, former Red Army soldiers joined armed peasants to sabotage railway lines and eliminate German officers. In the Amur region, Yakut clans rebelled against Japanese authorities, burning ammunition warehouses and ambushing imperial patrols. The Reich responded with total deterrence tactics. For each partisan attack, 100 civilians were executed. In cities like Smolensk or Tula, punishment zones were established where access to food was suspended as a collective measure. The Japanese implemented the Manchukuo model: massive relocation, forced propaganda, and intensive use of psychological terror. Without firing on American territory, the Reich had managed to isolate the United States, dismember the USSR, and reorganize Europe according to its design. Nazi diplomacy proved to be as lethal as its military machinery, establishing a new geopolitical order that seemed destined to last generations. Washington, without functional allies or direct provocations, maintained a foreign policy of passive vigilance. The American press debated whether what was happening in Europe was a threat or an opportunity. The Wendell Willkie government established the Continental Observation Committee, tasked with monitoring Axis movements without intervening. In Latin America, the fall of the USSR generated a domino effect of sympathies towards the Axis. Conservative regimes began to flirt with the idea of adopting similar models. In Brazil, President Vargas organized a Pan-American Congress in which the possibility of officially recognizing the new European geopolitical map was discussed. In this new order, alliances were no longer signed with ink, but with oil, coal, and slave labor. Berlin became the diplomatic capital of the world, where ambassadors from neutral countries lined up to be received at the Reich Chancellery. Tokyo, for its part, inaugurated its first consulates in Central Asia, celebrating its expansion without firing a single missile on American soil. The purge of the East, extermination converted into system. With open war concluded, the Reich transformed from warlike power into consolidated imperial power. Its objective was no longer to conquer territories, but to mold them according to a sickening racial vision. The Lebensraum had to expand, eliminating entire cultures and complete generations. The master plan divided the territory into 3 Reichskommissariats: Ostland, Baltic countries and Belarus, Ukraine, the rich agricultural region, and Moscovian, from the former capital to the Urals. Each region would be completely restructured under German racial standards. Implementation followed progressive stages. Between 1942 and 1944, millions of hectares were confiscated from Ukrainian, Polish, Belarusian, and Russian owners, expelled through systematic military operations. Pioneer colonists arrived, Germans selected for racial purity and indoctrination, receiving lands, expropriated housing, and slave workers for the hardest labors. These colonists, trained in specialized centers like the Akademie für Germanische Expansion, received accelerated courses in agricultural management, paramilitary discipline, and racial education. Many were young people indoctrinated from childhood who saw the colonization of the East as a sacred mission, the construction of a new Germania. The settlements were designed by Reich architects to erase all local traces: farms in the shape of swastikas, churches reconverted into Aryan community halls, streets renamed with names of Nazi martyrs. Each conquered town corresponded to a new map, a new language, a new history. One of the most sinister aspects was the total absence of external witnesses. In our reality, the Allies liberated and documented camps like Auschwitz. Here, without external intervention, the camps were never liberated, only closed by the perpetrators upon completing their task. The ghettos of Warsaw, Lwów, Minsk, and Riga were systematically emptied between 1942 and 1944. Without international pressure, gas chambers functioned without interruption for 5 complete years, being even expanded and improved. It is estimated that more than 8 million Jews were murdered, including survivors from North Africa and Palestine, transported through optimized railway lines from points as distant as Baghdad and Casablanca. Extermination technology was also optimized. In the Chelmno complex, rapid incineration methods were developed that allowed disposing of up to 1,000 bodies per day without leaving visible remains. In Auschwitz II, the crematoria were expanded with funds from the Ministry of Finance and operated 24 hours with staggered shifts. The industrialization of murder became part of the Reich's economic system. The belongings of the executed were classified, melted, or resold: dental gold, hair, clothes, suitcases, even ashes as fertilizer. Satellite companies controlled by the SS were formed that managed each phase of this economy of death. For Slavic peoples classified as Untermenschen, a system of calculated wear was implemented: massive deportations to labor camps with 18-hour workdays, insufficient food, and life expectancy of 6 to 8 months. Young women faced forced sterilizations or sexual slavery for Nazi officers. In Ukraine, Soviet kolkhozes were converted into forced labor centers. Former peasants were marked with black armbands and forced to cultivate food they could not consume. In Belarusian regions, labor camps were directed by SS officers who competed with each other to reduce the cost per living unit. Hunger was used as a weapon. Calories were rationed according to racial category. A German colonist received 2,800 calories daily. a forced worker, barely 700. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, or tuberculosis were ignored. In fact, their spread was seen as a natural cleaning mechanism. Simultaneously, SS commandos performed racial selections of children with characteristics considered adequate: blonde hair, light eyes, correct cranial structure. These children were kidnapped, transferred to re-education centers in Austria and Germany, where they received German names and total indoctrination. They were informed that their parents had died for betraying Germany. The best-known centers were in Innsbruck, Graz, and Halle. There, children were separated by age and trained to forget their mother tongue, their identity, and their past. They were baptized in pagan ceremonies of Germanic rebirth and assigned to selected families. After 6 months, most no longer remembered their original names. Some tried to escape. Stories of Polish children fleeing in the middle of the night, only to be recaptured by German peasants in exchange for food or favors, became cautionary tales among prisoners. Repeat offenders were sent to experimental psychiatric institutions where drugs were tested to modify behaviors. The destruction was not limited to bodies, but to culture. In Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk, entire libraries were burned, universities closed, historical monuments demolished. The Russian language was banned in schools, substituted by German curricula. In Warsaw, ghetto walls were reconverted into ceremonial walls. In Leningrad, rebaptized Petersstadt, Tsarist palaces were transformed into military centers. In Riga, the National Theatre was transformed into a conference hall for the Baltic Nazi Party. In Tallinn, the Museum of Germanic Renaissance was inaugurated with pieces stolen from destroyed synagogues and Orthodox temples. Local history was rewritten to convert Baltic peoples into degenerate descendants of ancient Aryan colonists, thus legitimizing their forced assimilation. Newspapers had to include a daily page with quotes from the Führer. Radio stations transmitted only German classical music and reports from the Eastern Front. Contact with foreigners was completely prohibited. Mixed marriages were penalized with forced labor or summary executions. Cultural resistance was harshly repressed. In Ukraine, clandestine groups tried to preserve manuscripts, traditional songs, and religious objects by hiding them in crypts, wells, and empty coffins. In Belarus, Catholic priests organized secret masses in barns and ruins. Some artists risked their lives recording folklore pieces on wax cylinders hidden in false walls. The objective was monumental but simple. In 2 generations, there should be no trace that independent civilizations had existed there. Eastern Europe would be rebuilt with cement, blood, and programmed oblivion. Each town would be rebaptized, each grave flattened, each language reduced to dead archive. The cultural map of Eastern Europe should seem in the year 2000 as if it had always been German, an illusion constructed through crime and planning. And without free press, without external correspondence, without international organizations, none of this was denounced. There were no witnesses, only archives, only smoke, only silence. The science of fear, when progress served total control. Without Western defenses to maintain, the Reich poured massive resources towards a military-industrial complex without precedent. It was not spirituality nor philosophy that guided this order, but science perverted into dogma, technology subordinated to racial ideology, and propaganda as absolute substitute for truth. The centers of Peenemünde and Cottbus merged into the Institute of Racial Propulsion, directed by German scientists and captured Soviet technicians. They developed the Donnerfalk, intercontinental rocket capable of crossing the Atlantic. With captured Soviet resources, the Reich produced its first nuclear weapon in 1947, tested in Central Asian deserts. The bomb, although never used directly, symbolized its absolute technological power. The Messerschmitt May 262 became the core of a renewed Luftwaffe with supersonic aircraft, fighters with rudimentary radar invisibility, and strategic bombers developed with Japanese and Italian assistance. The sky, like land and sea, belonged exclusively to the Reich. Technological advances were carefully theatricalized. Each test launch, each aircraft prototype was recorded on celluloid and projected in cinemas as part of official newsreels. Science was not only functional but ceremonial. Each invention had to be preceded by speeches from the Führer about the cosmic destiny of the Germanic people. The scientific race was nationalized. Universities were absorbed by the Zentraltechnische Behörde, which classified students by racial coefficient and ideological obedience. Scientists who showed humanistic tendencies were reassigned to marginal departments or directly purged. In contrast, those who proposed advances applicable to social control received prizes, properties, and public recognition. With military machinery controlling the exterior, Nazi medicine turned towards internal control. Eugenics became mandatory state policy. The Lebensborn program incentivized reproduction between racially pure women and Reich officers, while massive sterilizations were applied to disabled, mentally ill, homosexuals, and mixed-race individuals. Medical euthanasia was institutionalized as national hygiene. State clinics systematically executed adults and children with malformations or hereditary diseases. Doctors had become biological engineers whose task was to purge and optimize the population according to racial criteria. The Action 5 program expanded after the fall of the USSR, using former Soviet hospitals for biological experimentation. In Minsk, a former orphanage was reconverted into a pharmaceutical testing center. In Kiev, growth hormones were tested on genetically selected child population. Medicine became a form of statistics. Each citizen had a racial health file where their ancestors, reproductive performance, and genetic risk were classified. Medical visits were not voluntary. They were inspections. Health was no longer a right or condition, but a control tool. Once his power was consolidated, Hitler implemented the systematic elimination of Christianity. He considered all churches as ideological threats and weakening relics. From 1948, convents were closed, temples confiscated, and public masses prohibited. Priests had to swear loyalty to the Führer or be interned in special camps. The Catholic Church was dismantled and replaced by the Germanic National Church state structure without crucifixes or gospels, centered on ancestral Germanic spirit. In schools, all religious teaching was eliminated, substituted by Aryan-centrist worldview, where the universe acquired meaning only in function of the Germanic people. In Eastern territories, repression was more brutal. Orthodox churches demolished, monasteries converted into military bases, thousands of priests executed for spiritual subversion. The strategy was to eliminate any belief system that competed with Reich dogma. The new temples were concrete structures with pagan reliefs, where racial exaltation rituals were celebrated. Instead of saints, Aryan war heroes and German scientists were venerated. Religious festivities were replaced by Nazi commemorations. Christmas, for example, was transformed into Night of Purity, a day of racial reaffirmation. Children born on symbolic dates were baptized by state officials in ceremonies where they were placed a silver swastika and their Aryan Germanic vocation was proclaimed. Spirituality became a state tool, stripped of transcendence and reconfigured as ritualized obedience. Joseph Goebbels, elevated to Minister of Totalitarian Culture, designed a hermetic communicational ecosystem. The press was reduced to 5 official dailies per cultural district. Radio stations were mandatory in all homes, broadcasting only official hymns, Führer speeches, and reports on Germanic prosperity. Even street posters had to be approved by the Department of Visual Harmony. Each district had an assigned color, a mandatory motto, an image of the Führer, and a rotating photograph of exemplary citizen that would inspire obedience. Televisions were massively distributed to German families under state subsidies, but only tuned to the national channel. Programs included contests about Nazi history, dramatizations of discovered traitors, and fiction series where crimes were solved thanks to the Führer's wisdom. All textbooks were rewritten. History began with Germania and culminated in victory over Bolshevism. Christianity, the Enlightenment, and individual rights were systematically omitted. Classical literature was banned, replaced by war novels and biographies of the Führer. Shakespeare was declared product of Anglo-Saxon decadence. Cervantes, racially mixed literature. Only approved Germanic authors were allowed circulation, and all poetry had to rhyme according to Old High German pattern. Libraries were transformed into cultural affirmation centers, and access to their halls was restricted by level of genetic purity. Art was transformed into state aesthetic tool, monumental architecture, racial epic murals, colossal sculptures of Nazi leaders. Modern music was categorized as degenerate. Jazz and blues disappeared completely. Cinema was monopolized by the Institute for Filmische Wahrheit, producing exclusively historical propaganda and melodramas that glorified the party. Movie theaters were obligated to project a cult film each week: The Rise of the Reich, Hitlerjunge Volta, or The Spirit of Order. Children attended in school groups, uniformed, and had to write essays about what they learned. Censorship became pedagogy, and pedagogy devotion. Painting was confined to the monumental. Abstract, cubist, surrealist styles were banned. Only realistic portraits of the Germanic ideal were authorized: smiling soldiers, fertile mothers, wise elders. Art no longer interpreted the world, it imposed it. Hitler experienced a transformation that transcended political leadership. He was systematically divinized. In schools, loyalty was sworn each morning. His birthdays generated mandatory massive parades. His image presided over each institution. The Hitler Youth automatically recruited children from 6 years old, training them in defense, survival, and indoctrination. Fidelity to the Führer became universal filter for any position, residence, education, or marriage. Hitler, isolated from public contact, appeared only in ritualized events like secular liturgies. Each appearance was recorded, repeated incessantly, and converted into mandatory study material. His voice was venerated, his image untouchable. The Führer had transcended mortality to become practically immortal. Pilgrimages to the mausoleum in Munich, where his parents' remains rested, were institutionalized. Each German had to attend at least once in their life. It was there that eternal loyalty was sworn. A symbolic replica of the place was even built in each conquered province, so that all could spiritually connect with the Führer without needing to travel. The National Day of Renewed Oath, celebrated on April 30th, required each citizen to place their fingerprint and signature in the Book of Eternal Fidelity. Refusing meant losing labor rights, housing, and access to education. Faith was not optional, it was a requirement. The Wall of America, a surveillance that substituted war. While Europe sank under the Reich's banner and Asia was transformed into Japanese imperial extension, the American continent remained, for the first time in centuries, completely on the margin of world conflagration. Without Pearl Harbor, without troops to the Atlantic, without commitments to defeated allies, the United States entered an unprecedented stage: silent surveillance, forced isolation, but growing awareness that the planet was divided, and on the other side of the ocean reigned an ideology that would try to expand. In this timeline, Roosevelt did not achieve re-election in 1940. Without immediate European war pressure, the electorate opted for Wendell Willkie, Republican who promised to keep the country out of the transatlantic conflict. Willkie won with a discourse of internal reindustrialization and strict hemispheric defense. Although he did not sympathize with fascism, Willkie also did not believe in the viability of unilateral intervention against a victorious Reich. He established that America must be a beacon of freedom in its hemisphere, not the world's policeman. His cabinet translated this into strict isolationism. Shipments of aid to Great Britain were interrupted, diplomatic missions in occupied Europe were closed, and funds were redirected towards border militarization and Panama Canal protection. During the 40s, the White House functioned as defensive fortress, not intervene militarily but monitor permanently. Not form compromising alliances but also not allow infiltrations. Thus was born Vigilant America. The British fall and Soviet surrender were interpreted by Latin American conservative sectors as confirmation of authoritarian power. From Buenos Aires to Lima emerged movements sympathetic to fascism that, although not direct part of the Reich, saw in Hitler examples of order, modernization, and national restoration. In Argentina, the post-1943 military regime intensified relations with Germany through covert commercial agreements, Argentine cereals for German military technology. La Nueva Patria published editorials praising the new European order and criticizing Anglo-Saxon liberal decadence. In Brazil, the integralists regained strength in southern states, promoting Aryan American spiritual unity with symbols, uniforms, and rituals inspired by the Nazi model. In Mexico, army sectors sympathized with the Reich, especially in northern states where anti-American resentment was more intense. In Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, nationalist parties found new impetus in discourses of cultural purity, authoritarian centralization, and cult of charismatic leadership. These cells did not constitute consolidated governments, but ideological incubators that spread through universities, unions, and business circles. In Colombia and Venezuela, paramilitary groups emerged under discourses of national renaissance, adopting Germanic-inspired flags and persecuting minorities accused of cultural decadence. Some came to establish uniformed militias that patrolled popular neighborhoods under the excuse of restoring Latino spiritual order. By mid-50s, the global panorama was divided into two spheres, the Old World under the Axis and America fragmented but free. Social pressure led to course change. With Harold Stassen's election in 1952, the United States initiated continental consolidation through the Coalition of the Americas. This bloc was not just diplomatic treaty, but profound hemispheric reorganization. Under Washington direction and support from Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Chile, a network of military, technological, and economic cooperation was created as counterweight to the Reich. Common currency, Dollar America, was established, the Hemispheric Security Council in Quito, and mutual defense treaties that equipped South American armies with American technology. Additionally, continental institutions parallel to those of the Reich were founded: the Pan American Institute of Science and Technology in Caracas, the University of Freedom in Buenos Aires, and the Hemispheric Educational Channel, which transmitted anti-authoritarian programming 24 hours a day. The coalition was not homogeneous. Conflicts between authoritarian countries and consolidated democracies forced constant renegotiations. Even so, it consolidated as the only planetary bloc not subordinated to the Berlin-Tokyo-Rome axis. Nazi propaganda responded immediately. Through cultural emissaries and media financed from Berlin, the Reich accused the United States of building covert empire in the Western Hemisphere and described the coalition as plutocratic alliance of Jewish bankers. In the 60s, ideological confrontation between coalition and Axis did not materialize in conventional battlefields, but in information, cultural infiltration, industrial espionage, and accelerated technological competition. The Reich tried to infiltrate Latin American educational and media systems. It financed fascist parties, distributed anti-liberal pamphlets, and created networks of covert cultural emissaries in universities and youth organizations. Washington responded by founding the Office for Democratic Defense, agency specialized in tracking and countering Reich subversion on American soil. Television became symbolic battlefield. While German homes watched heroic series about Aryan colonists in Ukraine, American channels broadcast reports on repression in Warsaw, destruction in Minsk, and indoctrination in Leipzig. Cinema played a central role. In Hollywood, studios specialized in anti-totalitarian films emerged, dramas about escapes from Nazi camps, biopics of persecuted scientists, and fictions about future societies dominated by authoritarian regimes. These productions were translated and distributed free throughout Latin America by the Cultural Containment Program. The United States financed scholarship programs for young Latin Americans, forming a generation loyal to democratic values. Simultaneously, it promoted the ALCE project, Continental Alliance for Energy, megaplan to make America independent from Old World energy resources, Middle Eastern oil controlled by Germany and Siberian gas in Japanese hands. ALCE built nuclear refineries in Uruguay, solar panels in Sonora, wind turbines in Patagonia, and a continental network of hydroelectric plants connected to each other. For the first time in modern history, America did not depend energetically on Europe or Asia. Almost simultaneous nuclear development prevented direct confrontation. The Reich tested its first bomb in 1947. The United States achieved the same in 1951 with help from refugee scientists. Both blocs understood that nuclear conflict would mean the end of civilization. This mutual understanding led to the doctrine of hemispheric containment. Keep the enemy at distance through proportional threats without using direct force. This logic defined international politics for decades. No bloc frontally attacked the other, but both armed themselves, spied and indirectly sabotaged their areas of influence. In 1965, a coup attempt in Ecuador, financed by a party affiliated with the Reich, was frustrated by Brazilian intelligence in collaboration with American agents. The scandal, kept secret, confirmed that the Cold War was not diplomatic abstraction but constant pulse that affected every continental corner. Other cases occurred. In Bolivia, a fascist cell was dismantled when planning to assassinate the president. In Paraguay, plans for a clandestine radio station that retransmitted Nazi propaganda from a rural farm were intercepted. Each secret operation fed an undeclared war where weapons were ideas. Vigilant America was not heroic nor romantic. It was pragmatic, contradictory, occasionally complicit with dubious regimes that served as anti-fascist barriers. But it represented the only alternative to totalitarian uniformity that covered the rest of the planet. While Europe disappeared under Nazi marble statues and omnipresent portraits of the Führer, in America resonated, with difficulties, echoes of plurality, public debate, and right to dissent. Lines were drawn. The world inhabited two hemispheres confronted not only by borders but by principles about human nature and social organization. One believed in racial purity, absolute obedience, and centralized power. The other defended individual freedom, collective progress, and right to question authority. In that tension was born a new era, the global Cold War. The drums sounded distant, but their echo intensified year after year. Digital rebellion, the fall of the Reich, and the Third Global War. For 5 decades, the Third Reich and Japanese Empire dominated Eurasia with efficiency and brutality without comparison. What seemed an unbreakable structure began to crack from its margins, not with tank armies but with something unforeseen. Invisible waves of digital information, forbidden words that crossed borders, images that lit fires where everything had been ashes. Thus began the end of Nazi order. By the end of the 20th century, the Reich maintained Europe under control through technological surveillance and totalitarian censorship that seemed impenetrable. However, the development of the Internet in America and Asia, especially in the United States, Canada, and a partially reconstructed China, created an unexpected phenomenon: the capacity to transmit information in a decentralized and uncontrollable way. Despite the efforts of the Germanic Information Ministry, which had developed the closed Volknet system, Western hackers specialized in cyber warfare began to breach servers in Prague, Munich, and Stockholm. They leaked unpublished images, classified documents and recordings of executions, active camps in 1995, and torture in Leipzig laboratories. For the first time in half a century, European citizens, especially young people born under the regime, accessed irrefutable proof of the system's true face. Clandestine videos circulated through encrypted networks, recordings of slave labor in Siberian mines, testimonies of women raped in Krakow centers, photographs of experiments with children in Kaliningrad. The impact was devastating for generations educated in propaganda. Official censorship tried to counter with massive defensive campaigns, but the damage was irreversible. The myth of the perfect Reich had been destroyed by digital evidence. At the beginning of the 21st century, leaks translated into subversive action. The first significant revolt occurred in Budapest in March 2003. University students took government buildings shouting "Freedom, not racial purity." Prague, Bucharest, and Warsaw followed. The Balkans were first to organize coordinated armed rebellion. In Sarajevo, Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian insurgents attacked an SS barracks and transmitted the action live through pirate network, inspiring regional uprisings. France exploded in 2005 after leaking of the Montluçon archives, documents that revealed systematic execution of French intellectual leaders during the 50s to 60s. Paris became epicenter of protests, riots, and sabotage. The collaborationist government declared state of exception, but hundreds of military officers refused to shoot civilians, fracturing the chain of command. In the United Kingdom, still under forced neutrality but subjected to Reich pressure, revolt exploded in Manchester in February 2006. Clandestine groups took television stations and broadcast uninterruptedly documentary images of Nazi crimes. In 1 week, 20 British cities joined the uprising. The decorative parliament was dissolved by popular force and replaced by revolutionary councils. The Reich responded, as always, with extreme violence. The law of total purification was declared in Central and Eastern Europe. SS militias executed thousands of suspects of collaborating with insurgents. Universities were closed, hospitals militarized, camps in disuse reactivated. But totalitarian control was no longer absolute. The Reich's chain of command, designed for perpetual stability, was not prepared for digital guerrilla warfare that used technologies incomprehensible to its architects. In eastern territories, German troops massively deserted or were ambushed by armed civilians. In the Balkans, military governments completely withdrew from Albania, Macedonia, and Montenegro. In Ukraine and Belarus, nationalist cells reconstructed after decades of clandestinity recovered entire territories. The Japanese Empire simultaneously faced rebellions in China, Korea, and Siberia. Chinese nationalist groups, logistically supported with American capital and Brazilian technology, initiated sabotage that culminated with the taking of Shanghai in September 2007. South Korea was liberated by coalition of exiles and insurgent students. In Vladivostok, Japanese garrisons abandoned positions after months without supplies. Although the coalition of the Americas officially maintained direct military non-intervention, its logistical involvement was decisive. Through shared intelligence network between the United States, Brazil, reconstructed China, and resurgent Russia, massive material aid, military intelligence, encrypted communication technology, and tactical training were sent to rebel movements. American satellites retransmitted free radio signals across the entire European spectrum. Unidentified drones delivered medical supplies, cryptography equipment, and light weapons in Transylvanian mountains, Bohemian forests, and Baltic coasts. The Western press celebrated each insurgent victory as reenactment of the Normandy landing. In Moscow, a new post-communist Russian government led by liberal nationalist coalition financed externally began to advance westward. Armed with desire for revenge and promise of liberation, their troops crossed the Urals in 2009, connecting with Belarusian and Ukrainian insurgents. The Third Global War had begun. For a decade, Europe was transformed into battlefield between local insurgents, retreating Reich forces and Allied armies advancing from east and west. In 2010, French resistance recaptured Lyon after a 3-month urban battle. In 2011, Croatian insurgents liberated Zagreb with unofficial American air support. In 2013, Brazilian, Polish, and Russian troops fought the decisive Battle of Krakow. In Berlin, the Reich's leadership tried to resist with last resort, tactical nuclear weapons against their own cities in rebellion. But nuclear installations had been sabotaged by dissident German officers who secretly collaborated with the resistance. In August 2015, the Führer's bunker was captured by combined troops. No remains of the last Nazi leader were found. Official suicide was assumed. Allied troops met in Frankfurt in August 2015, establishing provisional European government. A new Europe emerged, free continent but traumatized by 80 years of repression, extermination, and institutionalized fear. From 2015 to 2022, Europe lived its most difficult transition. Not only rebuilding cities, but restoring societies deprogrammed from Nazism and deprived of democratic experience for generations. Denazification included prohibition of Reich symbols, dissolution of collaborationist parties, opening of regime archives, and truth commissions by country. The Free European Parliament was established in Amsterdam. Special tribunals processed war crimes of the final repression. In Berlin, over ruins of the propaganda ministry, the Museum of Totalitarian Memory was inaugurated, preserving documentary evidence and educating about dangers of authoritarianism. The first free elections were held in 2018. For the first time in almost a century, European citizens voted without coercion. New generations adopted the symbolic slogan of rebirth: never again for anyone, never again in silence. The history of the victorious Third Reich ended like all empires that believe themselves eternal, in ruins, open archives, liberated testimonies. Its fall was not the work of conventional armies, but of the unpredictable power of human spirit, amplified by a tool that its architects could never control: digital truth freely disseminated. The rebellion did not begin with a bullet, but with a pixelated image. The war was not declared by a state, but by a network of consciences that refused silence. Victory demonstrated that even the most total dominion can be reversed when memory refuses to be silenced. The world that emerged was not perfect. It bore scars of generations educated in hatred, societies fractured by repression, devastated economies. But it had recovered something lost: the possibility of dissent, the capacity to question power, and hope that no system is destined to last eternally.